Hello, friends. Back together here Thursday morning. I don't know if it's morning where you are, but it's nice morning here this morning, sunny and smokeless. Friends, we're drawing to a close of the section that we've been looking at in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, a very important message, as you realize from what's been looked at previously on the previous classes. And I was thinking it might be helpful to us because of this extraordinary vision of Shoghi Effendi. I mean, it's unique, and it's unique now, going to be unique for 1,000 years. The vision of the future, the vision of the present. Fortunately, we have in the Guardian's own words from The Promised Day Has Come, a message he wrote in the early 40s as the war was just beginning to expand. And he took an assessment. First of all, he characterizes what we're talking about, what's happened with the coming of Baha'u'llah. And then a bit further on, he draws a contrast between the world and the faith, contrasting what's the state of the world now, what's the state of the faith. And he iterates that through several different phases. We're going to take a careful look at that just to kind of bring us up to date, although that's already 75 years ago. And the processes that we see identified there, far from going away, they've increased in their intensity. So the first of the documents that we're sharing this morning has, for just the sakes of what we're looking at here, have been titled After 100 Years, this first one. Okay, I think we have the document up here now. After 100 years. Now, this is Shoghi Effendi's, he gathers all his forces, everything he's been talking about and he's been writing about for 2 decades now. He gathers his forces, focuses in and creates a new gem-like image of the position, the relationship of the faith to the world, the relationship of God to the faith. The whole thing comes out in this summary, after 100 years. Beloved friends, well nigh 100 years have elapsed since the revelation of Baha'u'llah dawned upon the world. A revelation, the nature of which, as affirmed by himself, none among the manifestations of old, except to a prescribed degree, hath ever completely apprehended. And we see this repeated in different passages in the Gleanings and other places. They had an idea of it, but not a complete vision of it. The prescribed degree was only to be seen eventually by Baha'u'llah himself. Shoghi Effendi first explains that for a whole century, God has respited mankind, that he's postponed any punishment for their not having recognized his revelation. They've just been postponing it. And for what reason? That humanity might, or mankind might, acknowledge the founder of such a revelation, espouse his cause, proclaim his greatness, and establish his order. This is the menu of what mankind needs to do, and what each soul needs to do. Recognize the founder of the faith, espouse his revelation, proclaim, teach his greatness, and establish his order. Let's be serving as teachers and as the builders of the New World Order. In a sense, as an overview here, he talks about 100 volumes of Baha'u'llah's revelation, which he calls the repositories. And let's look very carefully at this list. I've broken it down here for just for the sake of our bullet pointing it so that we get an idea about this. Priceless precepts, mighty laws, unique principles, impassioned exhortations, reiterated warnings, amazing prophecies, sublime invocations, and weighty commentaries. Some of you may recall in the Surah Haykal, the tablet of the temple, in the first section of it, Baha'u'llah affirms that whereas there were 5 categories of revelation in the Babi faith, there are now, he said, that we have given our teachings in 9, and that these 9 have been covered in the composite Surah Haykal, that is, in that opening and very specialized pronouncements of the nature of the manifestation and what's happening in this day, and then appended to that the tablets to the kings. And in these tablets to the kings, if, as I've said previously, I think he's established his authenticity, his position, and the altitude of which he is proclaiming his faith to mankind, which God has him proclaim his faith to mankind. And once that's established, like he's established his credentials, then he moves on to order the kings what they should be doing and not doing. Very bold and open proclamation to the kings. Those 9 modes of revelation, I think, match in part these, 8 explanations in the 100 volumes. This is not the only place he mentions the contents of 100 volumes. Later on in at the end of the chapter, after Baha'u'llah's passing, summing up the whole of his revelation, he again refers to different categories of revelation. You can look at those too. And I think this is where we can find, because there was never a tablet explaining what the 9 modes of revelation were. There's some scholars who've speculated about what this may be referring to, who may be much more accurate in this than my assessment, but I'm looking at what the Guardian keeps repeating here. And these seem to match the kind of things that the Bab had talked about, whereas was divine, the modes there were divine verses, prayers, commentaries, and expositions on various scientific and other subjects as 4 of the modes of revelation of the Bab. And then he said, we've added a 5th one, which are the previous 4, but now not in Arabic, but in Persian, in Farsi. So those were the 5 of the Bab, and 9, presumably those are encompassed within Baha'u'llah's revelation. And then he expanded it with all these other things. And much of this is reviewed or cited, the categories, for instance, of the quotations which we visited earlier in looking at the visitation, confirm some of these and explore them. And then, as mentioned earlier, those wonderful passages that he's placed in the end of the advent of divine justice, called from the whole of this, again, from this whole range of writings that Shoghi Effendi had access to, that he studied and then selected and then translated key passages for us in these various categories. To integrate, to see these all together, I think is very useful. Then, of course, Gleanings is an explosion beyond what he's been giving in his messages. He gives us this volume of selections representative of the whole range of Baha'u'llah's teachings. It is such a treasure for mankind. And he, as previously mentioned, I think I've mentioning, he called attention to it, that it should be a constant companion to every faithful Baha'i. So constant companion means you better have it at your bedside and on your desk and on your couch, and keep visiting it. It's nice to read through. The Gleanings, very helpful if you read through it and keep marking where you are until you get to the end, and then you start at the beginning again, and gradually you get a kind of a survey of the position of all the different subject matter that is raised and affirmed through these passages in the Gleanings. So here we have this: in 100 volumes, the bearer of such a message has proclaimed, as no prophet before him has done, the mission with which God had entrusted him. And we look at that and we say, okay, but look what he's saying there. He who was bearing this message has proclaimed, as no prophet before him in recorded history has done, the mission with which God had entrusted him. You can find no parallel, not even a slight parallel, in the manifestations of the past, where it's the range of proclamation and of subject matter has any equal to what Baha'u'llah has given us. Finally, I just to quote here from Baha'u'llah, also cited here in the Promised Days Come. We verily, he himself has testified, have not fallen short of our duty to exhort men, and to deliver that whereunto I was bidden by God, the Almighty, the All-Praised. Had they hearkened unto me, they would have beheld the earth, another earth. We have a very tragic situation. It's not unique in the history of religion. The coming of each of the manifestations, they were opposed at the beginning. But with such a revelation as this, there was such a range of opposition and curtailment in every sense of Baha'u'llah and of his followers that you just wonder, from the point of view of God, and Baha'u'llah talks about this too, we haven't failed. We've given, our duty was through revelation to tell you who God is, what he wants from us, and call us to account for it. But understanding these other various problems, he's given us a respite. The respite, okay, was 100 years. That would have been, 100 years would have been like 1944. And now we're coming up to the second 100 years. And the prophecies that Baha'u'llah has made about what humanity, if they don't take a hold of the message of God, are gradually revealing themselves, unfolding themselves, because it can't be without consequence. Although from a materialistic point of view, it seems to be that that's just the way it is, and we have to improve the conditions of humanity till people finally catch up with the revelation. No, the revelation is catching up with us, not us with the revelation. The revelation is an active, very vital force acting in the affairs of society. Baha'u'llah is the sovereign of all who are in heaven and on earth. He has this position, supreme position. And we would do well to trust that that guidance is going to come to account as we move along here. Now, this is coming specifically to what the eye encounters as we survey the international scene after 100 years. After a revolution of well nigh 100 years, what is it that the eye encounters as one surveys the international scene and looks back upon the early beginnings of Baha'i history? Friends, I don't know, personally, from my point of view, this is the orientation that we have to absorb and reflect in viewing the affairs of the world around us, in proclaiming ceaselessly the revelation of Baha'u'llah to others when we have the opportunity, we need to see it from this particular angle Shoghi Effendi has given us after 100 years. A world, first he gives us the world, then he contrasts it with the faith. A world convulsed by the agonies of contending systems, races, and nations, entangled in the mesh of its accumulated falsities, receding farther and farther from him who is the sole author of its destinies, and sinking deeper and deeper into a suicidal carnage which its neglect and persecution of him who is its redeemer have precipitated. You want a picture of humanity now, the way it stands? All of this is still so valid. Agonies of contending systems, races, and nations. Behold the confusion that humanity has fallen into. And notice the verbs he uses, convulsed by these agonies. It's really getting to the very, very desperate stage now, as we can see, as we survey the world's affairs and activities, entangled in the mesh of its accumulated falsities by having adopted, assumed a materialistic view of the world and its affairs. We've fallen into a mesh of accumulated falsities. One that, is God really in charge of affairs, or is he just an imagination that's there distracting people from getting on with the work of organizing humanity along the lines that they feel it should be organized? Also having accepted Darwinian theories of evolution from monkeys, very debasing, false teachings, contradicted by the revelation. And certainly the eternality of the existence of physical existence is affirmed over and over in the Baha'i teachings, which would give rise to holding the theory of the Big Bang as a theory in our mind, as something that's being discussed and trying to be proven, but has not yet been so. Receding farther and farther from him who is the sole author of its destinies, by ignoring Baha'u'llah, who is the author of its destinies, who's telling us where it goes, where it can go, and where it should go, where it must eventually go. By moving away from this author and from his revelation, we just are doomed for our darkness and sinking deeper and deeper into a suicidal carnage which its neglect and persecution of him who was its redeemer have precipitated. So neglect and the persecution of Baha'u'llah have precipitated this darkness into which we've all sunk. Abdu'l-Baha used to talk about the brightness of the future. The Guardian would raise this point. He'd say Abdu'l-Baha saw a very bright future for humanity. He said one of the things he was saying is that he saw a very dark immediate future. Distant future is bright, immediate future is very dark. We're seeing the breakdown of every aspect of human society, the relationship of individuals, the relationship with organized institutions, the distortion that all these falsities have led to, terrible confusion on our part. The only thing that sets our clock back and keeps renewing us is the verses of God which we approach reverently every morning and evening, and our continual study of the verses of Baha'u'llah and the interpretations of Abdu'l-Baha that we've been given. Then he talks about the faith. Something's happening in the faith during all this process. Still prescribed, very limited by the institutions and things that persecuted, yet bursting through its chrysalis, which is in the early stages, very early stages of its development. It's still an embryonic faith in that sense. Emerging from the obscurity of a century-old repression, in certain ways, the faith has been more clearly defined and can be accessed on the internet and in ways that were not available even after 100 years. The faith is face to face with the awful evidences of God's wrathful anger. My God, review the century just before us. How many millions of people were killed because of these contending systems of different nations? And feeling that by eliminating one or another class or race or something, we were going to have a resurgence of better times. Awful evidences of God's wrathful anger. Now, you know, if you're going to take this and say, well, I don't believe in that kind of God. He is a merciful God. He's a kind God. If you read carefully the passages of Promised Days Come, you will see that Shoghi Effendi says that the punishment that God is wrecking on mankind for its neglect of his message and of the messenger that brought it is curative. It's like a father's discipline of a child. It's out of love that he is given us a respite, out of love that he's let the processes of the gradual appearance of his revelation permeate into the world. Then he mentions here finally, and this evidence of God's wrathful anger, and it's destined to rise above the ruins of a smitten civilization. Back to the question of, are we going to repair our present day civilization? Are we going to make it better in every way we can? Yes, all right, we can, but we have to do that through applying the measures and teachings that Baha'u'llah has brought us. We're going to gradually witness on all sides, it seems to me, the ruins of this civilization. In fact, it seems that it needs to be burned, and the burning cleanses it, and then it needs to be welded, and the influences, direct influences, the forces of the revelation awaken in mankind through the suffering that it goes through, awaken them to the necessity and a willingness to comply with Baha'u'llah's request for the oneness of mankind, and moves us towards that, which then is the source of a new development, recognition of the oneness and wholeness of the human race, and even a partial recognition around the world of the faith in a greater degree than has happened, brings us from the embryonic stage of the administrative order, which is still in the womb, operating and developing in the womb of the world, through the guidance of the teachings and through the instructions of the universal laws of justice. We moving into, finally, we will move into a period where the allegorical child that's in the womb of the world, the administrative order, will be born and become a child, the world order of Baha'u'llah, where gradually more and more responsibilities for governance and the helping of the nations will be possible. Then he moves on another set. How does he characterize the world? Spiritually destitute, morally bankrupt, politically disrupted, socially convulsed, economically paralyzed, writhing, bleeding and breaking up beneath the avenging rod of God. What a picture. And does anybody see anything they don't recognize there? I think it's quite clear. Then it's a faith, again contrasted, whose call remained unanswered, whose claims were rejected, whose warnings were brushed down, whose followers were mowed down, whose aims and purposes were maligned, whose summons to the rulers of the earth were ignored, whose herald drained the cup of martyrdom, over the head of whose author swept a sea of unheard of tribulations, and whose exemplar sank beneath the weight of lifelong sorrows and dire misfortunes. All of that you can read about in detail in God Passes By. That's the response that the world has given to the most great favor, the most great mercy that's ever been visited on it by its creator. We have no precedent in the history that is available to us of any greater gift from God than the revelation of Baha'u'llah and the Bab. Now back to the assessing of the world. A world that has lost its bearings, in which the bright flame of religion is fast dying out, if not almost dead, in which the forces of a blatant nationalism and racialism have usurped the rights and prerogatives of God himself. Oh, he's the creator. He has the authority over us to decide what his creation will be used for. In fact, he's able to define, when we think about it, what the purpose of our creation is. We didn't create ourselves. We're here. We are. And if we're not for the messengers of God, we would never figure out what we were here for. And it's because people don't look at the message of God that they come up with all different kinds of reasons of why we're here and where we're going. Mistaken interpretations of human existence. This is the world in which a flagrant secularism, the direct offspring of irreligion. If the flame of religion goes out, we end up with irreligion. It's raised its triumphant head and is protruding its ugly features. This has affected every aspect of human life, government and education, all of our well-being, industry, diet, everything has been thrown into confusion, in which the majesty of kingship has been disgraced by the kings themselves. And they who wore its emblems have, for the most part, been hurled from their thrones. You can see a survey of, in Shoghi Effendi's book on the status of the faith at the beginning of the World Crusade. He outlines a list of the sovereigns who have fallen from their thrones. And since then, the process has gone on to include others. The once all-powerful ecclesiastical hierarchies of Islam, and to a lesser extent those of Christianity, have been discredited. This is another effect of Baha'u'llah's call to the leaders of religion to set aside whatever they were doing and arise and proclaim his faith. He's the author of the world's destinies. He's Lord God speaking to the kings and to the religious leaders, telling them, I'm here, here's my message, go out and proclaim it. And they didn't do it. They ignored it. They couldn't recognize. They certainly had the capacity to recognize. He said it's unjust to send a messenger and yet the people not have any capacity to recognize. They could have recognized, but they didn't recognize. They turned away. They were wedded to their own power and greatness. So they've been discredited. People don't no longer, they were all powerful at one stage. When Baha'u'llah came, the masses of mankind were pretty much under the direction of religious leaders, besides their kings and rulers. And if they had proclaimed the truth of God's latest revelation, if they had called attention of the masses to these teachings, he said the masses would have followed them. But they didn't. And then they became the greatest obstacle to mankind's recognition of the realities of the faith. in which the once all-powerful ecclesiastical, we just saw that, let's go on, in which the virus of prejudice and corruption is eating into the vitals of an already gravely disordered society. Prejudices of all sorts, probably more dominating right now, the race prejudices that we have, but also there's national prejudice, there's social prejudice, there's religious prejudice, all of these. And when you have institutions operating not under divine rule, not under divine right, corruptions come surging forth. And these, he says, this is like a virus and it's eating into the vitals of an already gravely disordered society. All these things, so interesting to think about them and try to get a balance of the greatness of the faith and of Baha'u'llah's revelation and of his position as the supreme revelator and manifestation of God straight in our spirits. A faith whose institutions, the pattern and crowning glory of the age which is to come, have been ignored and in some instances trampled upon and uprooted, whose unfolding system has been derided and partly suppressed and crippled in different countries, of course, whose rising order, the sole refuge of a civilization in the embrace of doom, has been spurned and challenged. People don't like world order. They don't investigate it before they don't like it. They just, the whole idea is because we're so wedded to excessive nationalism, whose mother temple has been seized and misappropriated. This, of course, is the house of worship in Ashgabat, and whose house, the house of Baha'u'llah in Baghdad, the cynosure of an adoring world, whose center of future pilgrimage, has, through a gross miscarriage of justice, as witnessed by the world's highest tribunal, that was the League of Nations at that time, been delivered into the hands of and violated by its implacable enemies, and finally uprooted and destroyed by them. With regard to this final point in case, we're suffering with the destruction of the house of Baha'u'llah, what a loss that is. We love both the house of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. We have a tablet from Baha'u'llah where he says that the greatness of these holy places, the significance of these holy places, the influence of these holy places is not material in nature. It's a spiritual reality which has been placed in that place. So if we raise up edifices in the same place, they will have the same power as the original structures, although it's a terrible loss, the familiarity of it. But in both cases, the cause has detailed plans of every aspect of these two houses and will in the future, of course, vindicate their loss through their reestablishment. Now, friends, I think we're ready to, we want to take a look at, we've heard previously that the Guardian was at pains to establish clearly the position of the Bab and his station. There was some confusion in the West. People thought of him as a herald, but Abdul Baha as the return of Christ. So he had a higher station in their minds. It was just the opposite, of course. Being a full manifestation of God, being the king of the messengers of God, as you've seen proclaimed in the Tablet of Ahmad and likewise in the writings of the Guardian. He was in a very terrific point, that the highest point in the whole destinies of the Adamic cycle are the promises and everything are centered in the person of the Bab, the primal point, as he refers to himself. So let us take a look at that. Let's see where we are. Okay, you have that on the screen now? Yes? So we're reviewing a little bit the titles here of the Bob. I wanted briefly to refer back to the beginning of the dispensation and to a summary of titles of the Bob which were mentioned there. In the second paragraph of the dispensation, Shoghi Effendi writes, dominating the entire range of this fascinating spectacle towers the incomparable figure of Baha'u'llah. And then he characterizes them. And then with regard to the Bab, he says, allied though subordinate in rank, and invested with the authority of presiding with him over the destinies of this supreme dispensation, there shines upon this mental picture the youthful glory of the Bab. And he characterizes himself in the following: infinite in his tenderness, irresistible in his charm, unsurpassed in his heroism, matchless in the dramatic circumstances of his short yet eventful life. Now we're looking again here to a summary from the writings of the Guardian about the Bab's titles. The Bab has been acclaimed by Baha'u'llah as the essence of essences, the sea of seas. Do you know where that reference comes from? Perhaps you do. If you don't, if we've cited it already once in the studies we've made of getting this correct understanding of the station of the manifestation early in an earlier session that we had. These two titles come from the Gone. You can look them up there and see in the context in which they're used there by Baha'u'llah. Then he's also been called the point round whom, by Baha'u'llah, the point round whom the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve. Extraordinary. From whom God hath caused to proceed the knowledge of all that was and shall be. Breathtaking. Whose rank excelleth that of all the prophets, and whose revelation transcends the comprehension and understanding of all their chosen ones. So this is at the end summarizing the Bab's mission. He had delivered his message and discharged his mission. And these were the characterizations of him by Baha'u'llah himself. His rank excelleth that of all the prophets. He's the king of the messengers of God. Amazing when you think about that. And that their realities are all revolving around him, the point, the primal point of creation itself. In so many ways, impend on with respect to all of the teachings of the cause. Then he goes on to say, he who was, we had Baha'u'llah's titles, now we're looking at what Abdul-Baha has said. In the words of Abdul-Baha, the morn of truth and harbinger of the most great light, and whose advent at once signalized the termination of the prophetic cycle and the inception of the cycle of fulfillment. Prophetic cycle, also known as the Adamic cycle, and the cycle of fulfillment as the Baha'i cycle. So he marks his advent and appearance at once signalized the termination of the one and the inception affirms had simultaneously through his revelation banished the shades of night that had descended upon his country and proclaimed the impending rise of that incomparable orb whose radiance was to envelop the whole of mankind. Now think of this as Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah, that incomparable orb whose radiance was to envelop the whole of mankind. And Baha'u'llah talks about that. When he came, his revelation touched every atom of existence. Then we have the Bab's own titles of his own appearance. He, as affirmed by himself, was the primal point from which have been generated all created things. Difficult concepts to meditate on, but certainly ones we don't want to just dismiss by saying we don't understand them. There are lots of passages about the primal point in the selected writings of the Bab, and also a much more in-depth elaboration in the Door of the Hearts, Nadir Saidi's book, Gate of the Heart, yeah. Then he says he was one of the sustaining pillars of the primal word of God, of course, along with the other manifestations of God. He was the mystic fane. The great announcement is, as promised in the Quran, the flame of that supernal light that glowed upon Sinai, this relating him here to the revelation of Moses, the remembrance of God. Another major title that comes also from the Quran, concerning whom, the Bab, a separate covenant hath been established with each and every prophet. That's something that is not always easily identified. And then Shoghi Effendi says, he had through his advent at once fulfilled the promise of all ages and ushered in the consummation of all revelations. With respect to the order that he announced, the order of Baha'u'llah that the Bab mentions in the Persian Bayan, the order whose foundation the promised one was to establish in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, which he did, and the features of which the center of the covenant was to delineate in his testament, and whose administrative framework the entire body of his followers are now erecting, had been categorically announced in the Persian Bayan. It's very interesting in the revelation of the Bab that he makes mention of this order of Baha'u'llah, which Shoghi Effendi then interprets to mean this new administrative order that's born out of the various laws and provisions that Baha'u'llah has provided and which matured within the mind of Abdul Baha and produced the child of the covenant, the institutions of the administrative framework of the faith. Now he also very selflessly says that this framework, the entire body of his followers are now erecting. He fails to point out how that's happening under his very careful direction and encouragement and guidance at each stage, bringing into these various the stages of these various administrative institutions. He's set them forth, he set them in a pattern, and he's left that as a heritage for mankind and a heritage for the House of Justice, who's now carrying on that work of elaborating and developing administrative institutions. Then he refers to the laws of the Bab. He says the laws which were designed on the one hand to abolish at a stroke the privileges and ceremonials, the ordinances and institutions of a superannuated dispensation, something that didn't work anymore, friends. And to bridge, on the other, the gap between an obsolete system and the institutions of a world encompassing order destined to supersede it. These laws had been clearly formulated and proclaimed by the Bab. with respect to the covenant the Bab established. The covenant, which despite the determined assaults launched against it, succeeded, unlike all previous dispensations, in preserving the integrity of the faith of its author and in paving the way for the advent of the one who was to be its center and object, had been firmly and irrevocably established. And we can't go into all the details of this, but quite all of them are set forth within the uh, volume, The God Passes By, written by the Guardian, to elucidate all of them. Then he talks about the light which throughout successive periods was to propagate itself gradually from its cradle as far as Vancouver in the west, and the China Sea in the east, and to diffuse its radiance as far as Iceland in the north and the Tasman Sea in the south had broken. This light had broken with the appearance of the Bab, the dawn of the Son of Truth in our era, in our time. Interesting to note in this connection of the propagation of the light of God that Shoghi Effendi has indicated that it passes through three stages. The first was the infusion of that light by the manifestations of God into the destinies of mankind during the heroic age of the faith. And finally, in the latter parts of the heroic age, the commencement of the diffusion. We had the infusion of the revelation itself, then the diffusion of its light, and this directed by the tablets of the divine plan, has carried the light of faith to the whole world, especially through the efforts of the Knights of Baha'u'llah in the World Crusade. And then the last of the stages, which takes place now that the diffusion is finished, we're starting to see the suffusion of the light of God. The diffusion of the light is over the surface of the world, entirely all the different countries. It arrived there and began the influence of its effects. Then the suffusion, the third stage, which is the penetration of the light of the revelation, which has arrived, diffused to all these countries. Then it begins to penetrate the very life and reality of the different countries around the world. That's at different stages in development, and he describes these stages of development as well. Then he takes account of the forces of darkness operating against the faith. The forces of darkness are first confined to the concerted hostility of the civil and ecclesiastical powers of Shia Persia, gathering momentum at a later stage through the avowed and persistent opposition of the Caliph of Islam and the Sunni hierarchy in Turkey, and destined to culminate in the fierce antagonism of the sacerdotal orders associated with other and still more powerful religious systems had launched their initial assault. Now, Shoghi Effendi said that the hostility of the faith towards the faith, which is a great motor that moves the cause, proclaims the cause in the world, because these organizations obviously have more means, material means and resources to attack the cause. And by attacking the cause, they draw attention to it. And more thinking people then say, well, what's this? Why are they so worried about this? And they look at the faith, and then through that we gain a much greater proclamation and recognition of the faith. But again, Shoghi Effendi says, if we're not teaching the cause, if the cause is not growing and its influence clearly observable in the activities of mankind, then they're not going to bother to attack it, because the brightest of them realize that attacking the faith draws attention to it, and it's only in a desperate need to try to suppress the faith that they will arise to attack it. But eventually, the gradual effulgence of the cause moving through communities, through the diffusion and now the suffusion of the light of the revelation, will produce manifold results, which will result in the persecution of the cause. How long is this going to take? I think that, the Guardian saw it happening quite contemporaneously with his own ministry, but it's taken much longer. And I think that's just because we haven't kind of arisen the way that uh, that the possibilities open up for us were there, and we didn't quite take advantage of them in the fullest degree. And so we're seeing that the forces of darkness are gaining, the forces of materialism and secularism are gaining power in the world and making it more and more difficult without the direct intervention of divine confirmations through the teaching of sincere, sacrificial, dedicated Baha'is that will make the attraction and confirmation of new souls coming into the cause grow everywhere. It's happening in different places in the world, but that program needs to greatly increase. And when the House of Justice was called for these 5,000 accelerated programs of growth in the different communities, it's quite related to that. Finally, he says, the nucleus of the divinely ordained world-embracing community, a community whose infant strength had already plucked asunder the fetters of Shia orthodoxy, and which was, with every expansion in the range of its fellowship, to seek and obtain a wider and still more significant recognition of its claims to be the world religion of the future, had been formed and was slowly crystallizing. This community, divinely ordained, world embracing, it's constantly crystallizing. And on what basis do we claim that the faith is a world religion? Shoghi Effendi, in some of the materials we looked on earlier, said it depends on two things. One, it depends on the nature of Baha'u'llah's own proclamation, his claims as to who he was, on the one hand, and on the other, the extent to which those claims have been recognized and championed by various individuals throughout the world in the international community. And that constitutes its gradual crystallization. So we all need to be like luminous fragments of his light, illumining the horizons of mankind in the future. And lastly, the seed, endowed by the hand of omnipotence with such vast potentialities, though rudely trampled underfoot and seemingly perished from the face of the earth, certainly at the end of the Babi dispensation it looked like that, had through this very process been vouchsafed the opportunity to germinate and remanifest itself in the shape of a still more compelling revelation, a revelation destined to blossom forth in a later period into the flourishing institutions of a worldwide administrative system, and to ripen in the golden age as yet unborn into mighty institutions, agencies, functioning in consonance with the principles of a world unifying, world redeeming order. Friends, I think we can all recognize the necessity of absorbing this vision. This is the vision that the guardian has given us, and which is a specific function of the guardianship, and which he mentions later on in the dispensation as something that will be withdrawn if there were no guardian. We'd be failing the ability to reach and see into the future the effects of the revelation. And I know that we can only be grateful that one of his great gifts is that he's established the stages of this development clearly in his own writings. How are we doing for time? I think this is an hour, getting up to the very last hour here. We're going to start next week with this document from the centenary of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the centenary of the martyrdom of the Bab, sorry. And you can see that on the screen here, and you could print it out and look at it. And different aspects of the impact of the revelation of the Bab. We're taking this, we had his titles, and then we're going to have the impact of his revelation on the destinies of the faith and on the future of the cause. And then we're going to enter into a more closer study in the dispensation, the section on the Bab that's in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. So if you want to move ahead, you can see that. And now I have to find your chat. Where can I find that? Let's see. Moving back to the top chats here, okay. Friends, let's see what we can deal with. Thank you, Gwen, for your remarks. Thank you for sharing these. You are very much appreciated. Dear friends, welcome to Mr. Dunbar's class. For ease of use, please begin. Okay, questions. Let's see now if we have Thursday class materials. After 100 years, thank you. David Mayton here. Question, you mentioned the revelation is integrating with affairs of mankind. As a member of the house, did you have the feeling that Baha'u'llah was patient or impatient with the progress of mankind? Well, anything I could tell you would be my own individual perception, but I think it's clear from all the things we're studying here, from the Guardian's writings and from my own experiences with the House of Justice, that we're watching the situation get increasing. The chaos that mankind is facing is a terrific challenge to all of us. And he said that the Baha'is are not going to be free from suffering in this. They suffer along with everybody else. Somebody has asked for analyzing the passage starting in Promised Day Has Come, pages 113 and 114, about the theories and policies so unsound, so pernicious, which deify the state and so on. Friends, it's the passage about the three false gods, and we will come to that, but it's not time to do that right now. That's part one. Part two, let's see. Question, exalt the nation, yeah. Yes, you can see how each of these phrases, are quoted here from Rabi, that are quoted from Prometheus, come how they relate to the questions of nationalism, of racialism, and of communism. One which exalts one nation, one race above other races, another that exalts your own nation, our own nation above other nations, and the other that exalts one social class over all other social classes. I'm sorry you've gone to a useless battle over vitamin C on the internet. Goodness. Robbie's. Thank you. So thank you from Canada. Welcome, Canada. What else do we have here? Back to questions. Question. If attacking the faith brings attention to it, that backfires and furthers the advance of the cause. Can you discuss the clash of differing opinions on the spark of truth in the Baha'i faith? This shining spark of truth cometh forth only after the clash of differing opinions. Well, I think one process we're talking about opposition attacking the faith is external opposition, and within the faith, very deeply established in Baha'i processes is that of consultation, which includes differing opinions, which leads to the spark of truth. And certainly the House of Justice operated on that. It didn't, at the beginning of a consultation, it didn't suddenly have the answer to the questions that were before it, but they had to be discussed and weighed. And finally, when the majority became oriented to the direction that a particular issue was going, then it was adopted. Mostly that came as a result of these consultations and the spark of truth and so on. Very seldom did the House of Justice resort to having to vote on anything. It was understood, we saw, well, 5 or more members are behind this thing, and the members would line up. It's very interesting from that point of view. Friends, we're over the hour. And again, it was a pleasure to be with you. I wish I could see each of your radiant faces and wish you a wonderful week ahead. And thank you for joining in. It gives me a chance to keep reviewing these marvelous teachings. I mean, because the class is coming up, then I have to organize myself and look at them again and think about the whole range of quotations which relate to these essential verities that we've been and we hope to see you next week. Thank you.